First of all, thank you so much to SFU and the School of Communication and Jason, who helped with the logistics of making this trip happen, and the generous support of Adrian, and of course the very gracious welcome I've received from Svetlana and some of the graduate students I've met along the way today. It's my first time in Vancouver, and it's been a really lovely visit so far. So thank you all for welcoming me and making this happen. So to preface the talk, this really represents early stages of thinking about food, farming, and soil in the Russo-Ukrainian War. So I'm trying to think through both visual representations, media representations, and elemental media, and make sense of the interplay of these elements. So far, it's early stage. I'm working with discursive and visual media, and I'm planning to build this out through further ethnographic engagement with some of the food sector actors and artists who I'll be talking about today. So there's more work to be done, and I really welcome your feedback. And I'm sorry, I think I'm gonna, hate to do this, but I think I'm gonna have to sit just because I know I'll fall behind on my slides otherwise. So let's get started. Maybe we can do it. I'm missing, I need a podium here or something. All right, so a year ago, in March 2023, a Moscow supermarket circulated an ad that they were, quote, happy to announce the start of sales of Ukrainian chernozem, referring to the famous black soil rich in organic matter that carpets over 65% of arable land in Ukraine. So the ad uses the Russian name chernozem, and other than quoting it, I'll be using the Ukrainian chernozem. So this humus-dense soil, extending up to 1.5 meters below the surface, is prized for its agricultural productivity and has long featured in narratives of Ukraine as a fertile breadbasket. The ad continues. Chernozem is a unique natural resource famous for its fertility. After conducting all the research, we can say with confidence that thanks to the properties of Ukrainian chernozem, your plants will be healthy and fast-growing. So despite being reported on by various news outlets in the region, the veracity of this ad was not confirmed, and it may indeed be apocryphal. While the supermarket did not comment directly on the ad, they later posted that their website was hacked. So whether Ukrainian soil was actually being sold in Russia in this instance, or whether it was a ruse by pro-Ukrainian hackers, numerous Ukrainians still commented online that this was nevertheless a plausible enactment of overt colonial land theft and not at all new. Some recalled Soviet-era claims of Nazis sending trainloads of Ukrainian black earth back to Germany in World War II, and others pointed to more recent soil poaching episodes, such as a 2011 case in which soil thieves reportedly absconded with a 2-meter deep layer of black soil dug out from a 10-hectare field in the Kharkiv region. The investigative journalists also turned up tons of ads purporting to sell chernozem. The work of anthropologist Deborah A. Jones shows that these soil poaching episodes are not exceptional, but rather recur across Ukrainian narratives of modernity and serve to critique the violence of resource extraction by, in turn, Russian imperialists, Soviet central planners, and post-independence by foreign investors or local hucksters. Soil poachers are seen to loot not only the mythologized chernozem, a natural resource and national asset, but also by extension, the harvests that should produce into the future to feed the nation and grow its wealth. Stealing the soil is thus an existential wound in the agrarian imaginary, for, as Jones argues, it troubled the permanence of Ukraine itself. So as much as there is to say about this particular trope that recurs in Ukrainian culture, what I'm interested in here is the prominence, indeed the virality, of a minor story about garden soil and what it indicates about the place of soil, dirt, and close relatives like mud in the mediated landscape of Russia's full-scale invasion. Since the more intensely urban fighting in the first few months of the war, farmers' fields have become a frequent backdrop of frontline and post-combat aerial images, whether in mainstream news coverage or the dense social media feeds of war bloggers, activists, politicians, propagandists, and others on sites like Telegram and Twitter or X. In the ubiquitous drone and satellite imagery that circulates in these digital spaces, the topological contours of agricultural productivity, such as flat fields demarcated by tree lines and access roads, are seen from above, materializing the dominant horizontal imaginary of the war's progression, which Svetlana has written about. These aerial images are speckled with bomb craters exposing raw earth and anti-tank hedgehogs and burned out vehicles, which compress and contaminate the soil below. First-person body cam videos, which are hauntingly game-like, snake through trenches and hideouts dug into the forested edges of farmlands, navigating embanked networks that use the ground itself as a defense. This dystopian pastoral backdrop has been accompanied by media narratives invoking general mud and the treacherous rasputitsa, or muddy season, to make sense of the timing and viability of various offenses and counteroffenses, suggesting that dirt is an actor in shaping outcomes at tactical and strategic levels. These examples indicate the prominence of soil in the media landscape of the war, and it directs us to look more closely at the political and ontological operation of soil and agriculture more broadly in this warscape. Earth has been frequently depicted as both a site of conflict and an agent in it, reflecting what I'm coming to think of as an elemental geopolitics of agriculture, with deep roots in the visual field. Soil, in particular, mediates the war in several important ways. First, I'll explore how the use of aerial image technologies to diagnose soil damage not only reflects, but also helps to produce Russia's war of aggression as in part an agricultural war. Because much of the country's damaged farmland has been mined or is under occupation, it is often accessed by soil scientists, environmentalists, and others through satellite imagery, testing soil as a technoscientific object of intervention through remote and speculative forms of knowledge that define and delimit the relationship between soil harms and the future of agriculture on the land. How both agricultural violence and modes of repair are imagined has profound implications in a country where agriculture accounted for 40% of Ukraine's exports and roughly 10% of GDP. So here, these are stats that I pulled from just before the full-scale invasion. So these were kind of projections of global Ukrainian contributions to global markets. And then on the right is a diagram from last year from the Kiev School of Economics, starting to map where agricultural damages were recorded. So first, I'll talk about aerial images and how they're used to diagnose soil damage. And second, I'll consider how dirt and soil can be seen to elementally mediate the war in ways that I'm still working out. But I begin here with the interventions of several contemporary Ukrainian artists engaging with its materiality and politics. Soil is a marker of place and time, but also of identity, memory, and connection. It bears the sediments of historical record and also grows the food to reproduce us into the future. And now, not for the first time, it bears the toxic scars of war. These artists use dirt as a medium to channel some of these experiences, exhibiting how, echoing anthropologist Christina Lyons, soils, quote, harbor the irreparable wounds and tracks of violence, and also the germinations of transformative proposals and alternative dreams. So any engagement with Ukrainian agriculture must confront how the country has long been narrated through resource imaginaries, underpinning the longer histories of imperial violence, as environmental humanities scholars like Tanya Richardson, Daria Tsimbalyuk, and Lisa Semchuk have all recently argued. Asya Basterieva suggests that this resourcification of Ukraine positions its territory, natural resources, and people as an operational space for material transaction. She argues that depicting Ukraine as a regional breadbasket is a socio-technical imaginary mapped onto the country by both European and Soviet modernities in their own ways. She writes, they do this through the parallel processes of geological prospecting and territorial imagination, which envision the infinitely fertile black soil and mineral richness of a land that could easily feed the whole world, an inexhaustible resource unconditionally given by nature. So these resources, of course, have helped to underwrite everything from foreign land investments and the IMF's structural adjustment prescriptions to the desire of many recently in the US as elsewhere, especially in the Republican Party, to tie military assistance to Ukraine to acquiring mineral rights. So just as an example from June of this year, this is Lindsey Graham appearing on Face the Nation, sort of opining that, yes, we should be giving more military, unlike some in my party, military aid because of the 10 to 12 trillion dollars of minerals that are lying beneath the surface in Ukraine, and we need to give that military support in exchange for access and rights. And then right on cue, as I was editing my talk this week, don't worry about this small text, but this is just a meme that popped up. I saw it in my social networks. Variations of it have been going around for a while, where it sort of says, this is on Facebook, right? My parents' generation, like a family friend. For those who ask, why does Ukraine matter? This is why Ukraine matters. And then it's this long list, sort of enumerating and valuing where Ukraine ranks in terms of global contributions to various minerals and other resources. And it's got in the list some agricultural so-called assets, reminding us why we should value Ukraine. So underpinning such imaginaries are different ontological approaches to soil that define and value it through different relational systems, which an emergent interdisciplinary humanities scholarship on dirt and soil helps us to query. Eco-critic Heather Sullivan observes that dirt, soil, earth, and dust surround us at all scales. We find them on our shoes, bodies, and computer screens, in forests and fields, and floating in the air. Collectively, they constitute an elemental medium that we move through and with as it accompanies us everywhere. Indeed, Sullivan suggests, dirty nature is always with us as part of ongoing interactions among all kinds of material agents. Dirt is thus more process than place. Further, as Christina Lyons and Maria Puig de la Bellacasa observe, the processes inherent to soil are not only the life-nurturing qualities we associate with fertility and growth, but are just as much processes of decay and decomposition. It is a medium that digests and breaks down all living things eventually, nourishing itself to support the growth of new life. So it therefore complicates the distinction between living and dying, and indeed mediates between the two. So like water for Melody Jew and wild blue media, or atmosphere for Yuriko Furuhata and climatic media, dirt is not a coherent material entity or singular element in any real way, but rather a hybrid and mobile assemblage. Its elemental nature is composite and its agency is plural and dynamic. It is therefore helpful to think about dirt and soil through the lens of elemental media studies, which, following Nicole Starosielski, invites us to look more closely at constituent parts rather than attempt to reconstruct essential wholes. Elements compose, she writes. They are relational, not discrete. Rather than standing apart, they attach, bond, and transform. Nevertheless, soil is frequently invoked in economic and scientific contexts as much as in the popular imaginary as a coherent thing in itself, a distinct substance any of us can point to and identify. And also, Puig de la Bellacasa points to the way that dirt and soil can function really effectively as elemental analogies, borrowing from ancient cosmologies, and that it can, that's another way that circulates and functions as an elemental whole. So thinking with soils amidst war thus entails investigating how it is composed and made visible, and also what it buries under violent conditions. It also leads us to explore how different meanings are attached to soil within mediated representations of the conflict and within Ukrainian socio-material relations with it, including farmers displaced from or returning to their fields, soldiers negotiating its surface and digging into its lower layers, soil scientists assessing damage and prescribing remediation techniques, and speculators or investors looking for value in it. And finally, thinking with soils at war underwrites different ideas about what it means for ecological and social healing and what temporalities are bound up in different visions of care. Whether this techno-scientific approaches to social science that peg soil fertility to human demand, which Puig de la Bellacasa identifies as a progressivist, productionist, and restless mode of futurity, or alternately, temporalities of care paced with the more than human interdependencies of living soil worlds, which indeed can take thousands of years to regenerate the fertility of deeply damaged soils. Modes of soil care and soil ontologies are entangled, she writes. What soil is thought to be affects the way in which we care for it, and vice versa. Okay, so visualizing soil at war. How then are dirt and soil seen, sensed, understood, and valued in this war through their visual mediation, especially through the cartographic gaze of aerial imagery? How do we conceptualize and materialize soil at the intersection of fertile productivity and violent territorial seizure and contamination? How is soil damage assessed at a distance, and who defines and undertakes its repair? To approach these questions, I'll first say a few words just to sort of contextualize about the composition of the agricultural sector, and then talk through some of the types of damage that have been registered so far in the soil during this conflict. So the agricultural sector in Ukraine is variegated in structure with a substantial export-oriented segment characterized by concentrated ownership of land and intensified industrial farm production. But at the same time, it also hosts a significant and diversified rural community base that continues to support resilient localized food systems grounded in small-scale sustainable production, peasant solidarity, and food sovereignty, if you will, even though this is not the terminology generally used by Ukrainians who the great work of Natalia Mamanova looks into, and she says that there hasn't been a strong identification among rural populations with this idea of food sovereignty, which is seen as a foreign idea, but she calls it a kind of quiet food sovereignty or food sovereignty by another name. And her recent research also notes how there's beginning to be some uptake in this idea, especially since the full-scale invasion. So approximately 55% of Ukraine's 33 million hectares of arable land were estimated to be under the control of a relatively small number of local oligarchs and large-scale export-oriented agribusinesses called agri-holdings, including some backed by foreign investors in Europe, North America, and elsewhere like Saudi Arabia, although things are, affected during the war. But the remaining land was used by over 2 million Ukrainian families, family farms, and rural households. Layered atop this contested terrain, the majority of fighting has taken place in some of Ukraine's most fertile soil zones, and thus all forms of farming have been exposed to significant damages. This includes mechanical damages to the soil, primarily from blast craters and the movement of heavy military equipment, as well as the construction of fortification and trenches, and also increasingly the processes of demining, which has a big impact on the surface layer. So the widely used T-64 tanks, for example, each weigh almost 50 metric tons. And so the compaction they cause damages the structure of the soil. So you can see here how soil compaction can be visible through satellite images. Compaction damages the humus layer, which in turn disturbs the soil structure and water balance and facilitates wind and water erosion. The construction of fortifications on the surface and underground increases landslides, waterlogging, soil subsidence, and other issues, while bomb craters destroy and displace large amounts of soil and affect soil moisture and organic material. Even the process of demining territories, as mentioned, severely damages the humus layer and alters the physical and chemical properties of soil, with adverse consequences for fertility and water retention. Other physical impacts on the soil come from the vibration effects of ammunition firing and bombardment, radioactive exposure if, say, depleted uranium rounds are used, and the thermal effects of fighting and transportation from exhaust gases and other sources. Geochemical disturbances to soil ecosystems are also widespread, particularly the presence of heavy metals like cadmium, copper, arsenic, mercury, chromium, and lead from detonations and leaching from unexploded ordnance and fuel. Explosives with different constituent substances release nitrogen, soot, hydrocarbons, lead, manganese dioxide, and other derivatives, much of it into the air, only to later settle on the land. Where petroleum products like fuel and lubricants have spilled, the chemical composition of the soil is altered, decreasing its ability to self-recover. One recent estimate suggests that approximately 1/3 of Ukraine's territory is contaminated to some degree. So because of ongoing fighting and the extensive mining of liberated land, scientists across Ukraine have turned to aerial imagery to study many of these forms of damage as best they can. In a recent presentation, Anastasia Splodatel, a researcher at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, explained that while there are international frameworks for the remediation of lands damaged in conflicts, to date, unfortunately, she says, no universal methodology have been created for the assessment of post-war lands and approaches to the permissible level of their pollution. Under these conditions, another researcher, Oleksandr Bonchkovsky, who heads the Natural Sciences Department of the Society of Researchers of Ukraine, has been conducting a pilot study of soil damage near Chernihiv, north of the capital, Kyiv. He explained in an interview that they are developing a methodology to assess soil damage, primarily based on analysis of Maxar high-resolution satellite images, in order to identify the size and number of craters on a selected territory, determine their morphometric parameters, and calculate the amount of displaced or lost soil. These measurements are then used to estimate physical and geochemical damage, given the area of contaminated territory. In addition to the direct contamination of the soil extrapolated from such data points, many secondary disturbances are rendered visible to varying degrees. So we can see the effects of shelling that have ignited fires in fields, waterlogging, soil salination, and humification, and intensive mining of the land by retreating combatants. In a similar type of analysis by the Ukraine War Environmental Consequences Work Group, a network of environmental activists, researchers, and journalists compared 1 square kilometer of fields planted with winter crops before and after bombardment in the Izium district of Kharkiv Oblast or region. The group counted 480 craters. So this has become somehow, I don't know why, but this particular one has become really an iconic image of the war. And so they're looking at this, and in this image, they are counting 480 craters made by 152 millimeter shells, 547 craters made by 120 millimeter shells, and 1,025 craters made by 152 millimeter shells. From this inventory, they estimate that the square kilometer plot is now contaminated with roughly 500 metric tons of iron, 1 ton of sulfur compounds, and over 2 1/3 tons of copper. The volume of heavy metals and other compounds is more difficult to calculate. They also estimate that the shelling displaced at least 90,000 tons of soil in this 1 square kilometer. The impact of physical fortifications can also be clearly visualized, like we see in this image from Luhansk. Large triangular anti-tank obstacles called dragon's teeth are made of reinforced concrete and recall similar structures from World War II. They form long defensive lines along much of the southern front to impede Ukrainian light armored vehicles and infantry, and appear in all 4 of the partially Russian-occupied regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. It may indeed not be economically viable to remove these heavy structures in the near future after the war ends. Finland erected dragon's teeth in the 1939 to 1940 winter war with the Soviet Union, and they still stand in the Russian region of Karelia. So these types of images might serve as documentation of long-term alterations to the landscape. And one last example. The researcher Spodletel explained that one of the most catastrophic agricultural consequences of the conflict is pyrogenic soil degradation resulting from fires, whose smoke and burnt residues are often visible by satellite. Such fire damages increase water and wind erosion into the future and replace the humid layer with a hydrophobic layer that limits absorption of water. So here we see a comparison of the same fields in the southern Kherson region in mid-July 2021, and then the same fields in 2022. So by using the same satellite images to assess soil damage as those used by the military and broader publics to track movements in the war, these scientists offer a techno-agrarian repurposing of the weaponized gaze of the military-industrial media complex. As such, these images comprise an important part of what Lisa Parks calls militarized media coverage, encompassing the overlapping practices of reporting, mapping, and monitoring that collectively mediate conflict through technological contestations over vertical space, which for Parks extends from beneath the Earth's surface to the outer limits of orbit, where reporting documents and interprets world events for media consumers. Monitoring involves the use of media for surveillance, profiling, and targeting. The third component of media coverage, mapping, is most relevant for me, as it highlights how aerial images like satellites fuse together the overhead projections of traditional cartography with digitized photorealist perspectives from above, normalizing in recent decades a panoptic visual epistemology that enforces what Parks calls vertical hegemony, and struggles to contain complex events and produce particular ways of understanding them. One effect of this mapping function is to presuppose the viewer is monitoring and supervising both human and non-human movements on Earth, infusing the viewer with not only the capacity to ostensibly see and know, but also to transform material conditions on the surface. These examples of landscape mapping show us an entanglement of visual and ontological instabilities that open up different potential futures. First, as a mode of visually reproducing the conflict as an agricultural war, these types of images are forms of documentation of ecological harms and damages that no matter how partial their representation may be of surface level or below ground ecosystems, they will nevertheless be instrumental in making evidentiary claims in future potential prosecutions of, say, crimes of ecocide, claims for reparations, and other legal and financial political actions. There are also diagnostic tools in the hands of soil scientists, environmentalists, farmers, and others who employ speculative operations of deduction, extrapolation, and estimation to assess the relative health and prescribe remediation measures and timelines. Despite what are likely the best intentions of these actors, the inaccessibility of many of these sites and the sheer size of the contaminated areas and the cost of other forms of testing like soil samples and things like that really heightens the power of these images to establish operational boundaries around soil as an object of study and intervention. These images are thus integral to producing soil in particular ways, vividly rendering certain types of damage that can be visualized. But what if the elemental complexity of soil's life world's not visible or even conceivable through the operational lens of those producing the data that will guide recovery processes and policies? Here we see some of the work that produces what Lyons, following Karen Barad, calls the agential cuts between the geos and bios of soil, attempting to fix the components of soil within and in spite of their inherent indeterminacy. I'm also left wondering how these images and the realities they produce may be used in other ways. Karen Kaplan and many others write about the ambivalent politics of drones, which can be used as military weapons and tools of surveillance, as much as they can bear witness to protests and humanitarian need. Given the longstanding pressures to liberalize and financialize agriculture in Ukraine, we must also consider how these diagnostic visual technologies could be incorporated into different agricultural futures, focused on land valuation and speculation, bioprospecting, and other tendencies toward resourcification of the land that may end up dispossessing smaller farmers and rural communities, or else producing differential temporalities of remediation for so-called higher value agro holdings over community level food production. All right, so I'm gonna start a new chapter. Dirt and soil are taken up and made meaningful in different ways by contemporary artists who are using it as a vital medium for communicating experiences of the war and imagining future healing. I'm thinking here with Puig de la Bellacasa, who would see in this work what she calls an eco-poetical significance. This slightly clunky term combines ecological thinking with ethics, as well as with poiesis, making or creating, and poetics, language, metaphor, story. This approach holds together living interdependencies through forms of co-creation that affirm and extend ethical obligation beyond the human rational subject. She suggests that it matters which ecological stories we tell. And so I round out my discussion of how soil is reproduced in this agricultural war through some of the emerging aesthetic modes of engaging with it. Katarina Alinek is an artist from the Eastern Luhansk region who relocated to Kyiv before the war. She has narrated and visualized displacement from her hometown through depictions of gardening and food preservation, which have helped her to make sense of the at times seemingly incomprehensible decisions made by people like her grandparents to stay in their homes within occupied territories. Reflecting on such decisions in a recent talk, she suggests that, quote, most of the time it's about things like attachment to the land and soil, inability to leave your home, in which you have put so much effort and rooted there. And these bonds sometimes are so strong that it is beyond logic or safety. Her separation from her grandparents began during the earlier phases of the Donbass War, which started in 2014. Her series of artworks from 2021, called Medicinal and Political Fantasies about Luhansk, use images of soils and plants, as she describes it, a metaphor for the not so visible and slow violence that infuses everyday life under occupation. In a recent talk about this series, she explained that gardening is an activity through which people preserve themselves even under the most extreme circumstances, as one's ties to the landscape, especially the landscape in which one grew up, is a permanent and indestructible relationship for people. In this work called Ukrainian Garden, we see the vertical landscape of human soil plant entanglements that shows soil as, in the words of Elizabeth Delafrey, a material and vital allegory for excavating the violence of the past. Humus, Delafrey points out, meaning earth or ground in Latin, is the root of homo, and hence human, and articulates the etymological and ontological relationality of human activity and place. The top player of the earth grows our food and records the stories of human agriculture, settlements, economic production, and war. It is not only human life and lineages that settle into the sediments. This series of paintings in Ukrainian garden in particular reflects what Alina writes about as the sneaking feeling she has that in the occupied territories that she fled, things are constantly changing. Although, she writes, these changes are slow and secret, completely invisible to our eye, exactly like roots in the garden. In her recent talk about this work, she expanded. And this is a bit of a lengthy quote from her. At first glance, landscapes where no one ventures anymore can appear to undergo a revival because people have stopped visiting. But my main point was that even if a landscape does not seem to retain traces of tragedy for long, in the end, a closer look usually reveals its presence. Artillery warfare, landmines, and blood changes the soil significantly over time. Liquids of war seeping into the soil, even in agricultural spaces. Landmines, wreckage from rockets, and human remains still forcibly coexist alongside edible plants. Remarking that Russian destruction has been concentrated in the eastern and southern parts of the country, well known for the fertility of the soil, she offers that this overlap reminds us that every battlefield is just a field in the first place. Looking forward, her work also reminds that it is not only human policy and recovery work that can help to heal the soil. She suggests that both human and non-human beings can influence the course of events and maybe even lead to a happy ending. Indeed, in her artist talk, she shared that her grandfather had planted a rare variety of grapes in Luhansk with the promise to her that they would be ready within a few years. Exactly, he told her, in time for Ukraine's victory, so that when she returns, everything will be in the best shape. I'll turn next to the work of Kyiv-based artist Katya Bukchatska, who traveled to liberated territories in Kyiv region to document how the ground was broken by shelling and bombing. In her short video work, This World is Recording, she contemplates memory and loss while wandering through violated landscapes. And she comes to imagine what recovery would look like if it entailed planting a new tree in every crater to help heal the earth and people left behind. So I'm going to play two short clips from this video piece from the beginning and from the end. Hopefully we have audio. World is recording.
Історія і значення місця легко можуть бути втрачені. І дивлячись на виво, я злякалася. Як багато ми можемо забути, і як багато можемо запам'ятати. Якщо посадити в кожну вирву дерево, ми б могли зафіксувати ці поранення землі, і цей сад став би живим меморіалом. Що мене розгублювало найбільше, це те, що все, що ти знав до війни, перестало мати значення, бо дійсність виявилася насправді зовсім іншою. Хоча я й уявляла новостворений сад, я шукала причину для його створення і взагалі причин думати про майбутнє.
This world is recording.
To the garden that she's planting craters. She'll return to it later.
Здається, цей меморіал включає в себе пам'ять про людей, екосистеми, ландшафт, врожай, землю, плани, територію. Втрата залиш втратою, але створення може протистояти знищенню. Можливо, ми будуємо меморіал не для того, щоб було іншого разу, а в повному обсязі досвіду можливого повторення ми саджаємо сад, щоб нам було що втрачати.
Here, the damaged landscapes, particularly the wounding of surfaces by bombardments, stands in for the violence of the war, with open and flooded craters depicting the absences of what should still be there. Older tragedies also rupture into the present through these open wounds in the land. She mentions the Holocaust, World War II, and in other parts of the video, the Holodomor, a mass famine genocide of the early 1930s. Even if we plant trees and grow gardens in the craters, loss will remain loss, she writes. But creation can resist destruction. The garden thus hosts the repetition of loss and also regrowth, the site of soil's fertility and decay, living and dying. Okay, Buchatska also traveled around Kyiv region in the spring of 2022 and collected soil from formerly occupied towns, which she used to make paint to create abstract artworks. As Katarina Yakovlenko notes, an art critic, she writes that her canvases don't depict anything. Instead, the traces of this homemade oil paint on the canvas convey the tragedy of places that endured violence. So the artworks are named Hostomel Red, Horenka Ochre, Mushtrun Umber, and so on. These are the names of occupied towns or towns where there were violent battles. So they're named for the town and for the soil. For another work, Black from the Front, she collected dirt from the battlefront, or so-called zero line. This work, of course, references Malevich's Black Square, signifying the end and beginning of something new. But she writes that the painting is also about nullification, which occurs through the destruction of territories, memory, and environments. The significance of the trauma, grief, and loss endured are conveyed, she writes, only by the soil that witnessed these crimes. Buchatska thus enrolls the materiality of dirt, which contains not only the complex biogeological assemblage of soil, but also parts of crushed houses and other social residues mixed in with it, to foreground soil as medium and content in her recording of place-based violence. So moving towards a conclusion. While these are but a few examples from a still incipient project, the broader corpus of mediations they belong to invite reflection on the material, ontological, economic, and cultural meanings infused into dirt and soil in this moment and place through these processes. Dirt forms the substrate of agricultural production, whether carbon-intensive industrial agriculture or sustenance-based local food systems, and also underlies most of the world war's fighting. Aerial imagery will continue to assert a vertically hegemonic logic over productivist approaches to recuperating soil's agricultural operations. But of course, returning to food production is also essential for Ukrainians and for the economic future of the country. So as Lisa Park suggests, even when inducted into civilian use for beneficial work like this, the panoptic logic of these militarized mapping technologies often serves to solidify particular forms of knowledge making and narrativizing terrestrial events and objects. In this case, such knowledge making is deeply implicated in what comes next. What does it mean to heal the soil's wounds? What temporalities, economic valuations, and social relations are involved in these processes? And of course, soils also harbor their own complex, more than human life worlds that enmesh but are not limited to human uses and abuses. As Heather Sullivan contends, we are enmeshed within dirt in its many forms, and our understanding of it must scale the cultural and the scientific. Indeed, it is often the slippage between the two that is most generative. I think these are concerns for media scholars, alongside other interdisciplinary researchers, building a nascent conversation on the multiple ontologies of soil, defining dirt beyond the domains of soil sciences and agronomy. We are aided in this work by the shattering work of artists who have made soil both a subject and a medium for asking what memories to make of the war and how to cultivate gardens for the future, even when the soil is damaged. In her work with agronomists, soil scientists, campesinos, and activists in Colombia, Christina Lyons cites the common appeal by all of the actors that she worked with in her ethnography. They would repeat, to sow peace, it is necessary to loosen up the land. The links between soils and peace continue to ask for our attention. So I'll close here with the words of Ukrainian environmental activists Alexei Vasilyuk and Valeria Kolodezhna. They write, it is too soon to estimate the number of craters across the entire combat zone in Ukraine. Today's war is ongoing, and hundreds of new such wounds appear on Ukraine's landscape every day. Thus, the task facing us now is not so much a calculation as it is an attempt to answer this question. What is our vision for damaged landscapes? Thank you.